Hi, class, and welcome to the final lecture for Psych 241, Social Psychology. Today, we are going to talk about the final chapter we will be discussing. Again, not the last chapter in the book. Today, we're going to talk about relationships and attraction. I always find this a chapter that's a lot more fun to end on than altruism. So with that in mind, a couple quick announcements, nothing too spectacular. Stop by office hours. If you don't know them by now, I'd be really surprised. Work on that paper as well. Remember, there are a lot of specific requirements for that paper. If you do have questions, you can stop by office hours or shoot me an email. But with that in mind, where are we going today? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about what brings us together. We're going to talk somewhat about proximity, a little bit with similarity. I'm going to save some of this for class, and then physical attractiveness as well. We're going to talk about that. But not only are we going to talk about what brings us together, we're going to talk about what keeps us together. So the different types of loving relationships or different kinds. We will speak briefly about attachment styles, but many of you should probably already kind of know this research. Relationship satisfaction will also be something we can discuss. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit at the end about relationship dissatisfaction and some keys to success. But starting off with what brings us together brings me to my first VLQ. We know the idea of attraction, or what attraction is it's the process of finding someone desirable as a romantic partner. Now, this could be attraction at first sight in terms of physical attraction, but there's other aspects of attraction, kind of mental attraction, stuff like that. And I guess with that, my question is, what makes someone attractive to you? So go ahead and just answer this question. And I guess if you're a little confused at what I mean, do you look at things like physical features, psychological features, personality traits? Are there other things? But in addition, I want you to tell me, do any of these things matter between what type of relationship you're looking for? Would you want some of these traits in a short-term relationship and not in a long-term, and vice versa? So go ahead and answer those questions. I'll give you a moment here to pause, and we will talk about some other stuff on the next slide. All right, so what brings us together? Well, one thing that needs to bring us together, literally, is proximity. We need to be physically close to people. Oftentimes, this is what gets people together, right? We can also talk about physical proximity in terms of this idea of functional distance, right? How often do people's paths actually cross? So, for instance, somebody can live, in the complex next door to me, and be very close from me, but I wouldn't likely cross paths with them because they are either in a different community than I am, or a different building, whatever it might be. We also, on top of this, have this propinquity effect, and more or less the idea behind the propinquity effect is that when we see and interact with people, when we spend more time with people, we start to like them more and more, and we're more likely to start a relationship with them. Now, that can be a romantic relationship, but oftentimes friendships. And so recognizing that, these are some things that are also changing in our world, right? Functional distance doesn't really change given FaceTime, camera, right? Just like being able to talk and meet people in other ways, Zoom, stuff like that. But it doesn't necessarily invalidate all of this stuff, because most relationships pre-COVID were brought about usually from in-person meeting. All of these pictures actually go with the propinquity effect oftentimes, right? This kind of is the idea of the girl next door, the boy next door, that the more and more we're kind of with that person who lives next to us, the more likely we are to become friends with them, and in these cases, date them. So when we talk about functional distance, though, I want to be kind of clear on this because it can be a little confusing. So Festinger and some colleagues looked at different housing at MIT, and they asked freshmen, list your closest friend at MIT. And how it works is the freshman dorms were 17 two-story buildings, and what they found is that 65% of friends, of their closest friends, were in the same building as them. Not only that, though, this is a model of how these buildings were built, so you can kind of see, right? So if you live in, say, right, room 8, you had a 41% chance of your best friend being in room 7 or room 9, right? 22% chance of them being in 6 or 10. I guess 10% at the far end of the hall is a little difficult with this number. But what I wanted to say that's really interesting, though, is door 1 and door 5 had more friends upstairs from the upstairs level than doors 2, 3, and 4. Why do you think that is? That's a really good question. Given this idea of functional distance, what is going on here? Well, you should be able to figure that out, right? The idea here is people upstairs, they have to walk past you if you leave your door open at 5 or 1, right? They have to walk past you to get out and leave or to go home. So if you keep your door open, they're more likely to stop by. They're more likely to say hello. You have a better functional distance. Because if I live in number 8 up here, I'm not going to walk up past number 2, then up past 1, 7, and 8. I'm going to just walk past 1, 7, and back to my dorm. So recognizing that this functional distance really does matter. Not only this, but in the police academy, what you see is that officers with similar names were better friends with those with different names, because officers in the police academy training are assigned alphabetically. So with my last name being Dickey, it's likely that somebody with a last name with like C, D, or E is probably going to be sitting near me. And because they're sitting near me, I get more chances to interact with them. I get more chances to become friends with them. So this is how this kind of works, is you just, first of all, got to get your foot in the door to be able to talk to these people. Now, what causes this propinquity effect? Well, one thing is that propinquity effect makes it more likely that you'll run into each other. But if you dislike somebody, that might also happen. So people tend to give the benefit of the doubt to people they expect to interact with often. So this is one way we know that this works, right? So if you think that you're going to be interacting with somebody a lot, you probably don't want to burn the bridge. So in one study looking at this, they were interested in how people were going to react with some ambiguous info about somebody, right? They're a kind of good person, they're a kind of bad person. So maybe they tell them, right, they are on honor roll and they help out at the local soup kitchen on the weekends, but they also were in jail for a robbery, right? So this is some mixed information. I don't know if I'm going to like this person. You're told you're going to meet one of them, and what they did was they just decided. They also said you're going to be either interacting with this person, or this is just somebody who you could have interacted with, or that you're not going to interact with. This idea of meeting them versus not. And when we talk about meeting that other person, that we think we're going to meet them, we kind of give them more of well, if I got to work with you, let's see how it goes first. So we might give that benefit of the doubt to people. Now, another thing we can talk about is not similarity. I'm going to skip that, and we're going to talk a little bit about some kind of interesting effects that happen. Which of these two do you think, or do you like more, just kind of at the outset? And we will talk about why this might be in class. I don't think this is technically a VLQ, but make sure to answer this question. Well, we can talk about this idea of a mere exposure effect, one of the coolest effects in psychology, I think, because this works even at more of a subconscious level when we don't necessarily recognize it. So one thing that might be happening with the propinquity effect is the mere exposure, right? The tendency for these new stimuli, things we haven't new stimuli, things we haven't necessarily seen before, are rated more positively after being repeatedly exposed to a person. So the more times you see something, the more you like it. Just merely liking it or seeing it several times makes you like it more, I should say. So Zients did this with what he called novel items. He showed participants a list of Turkish words in different versions of this. This could have been Chinese, different Chinese or Japanese. I'm not sure which one of these symbols. Looking at this with photographs of people versus mirror images of people. How much somebody actually attends class. The more often a Confederate attended class, the more attractive they were perceived, but it didn't change feelings of familiarity with that person. So, right, more or less, nobody necessarily remembers seeing these things or noticing that they're different. But this has something to do with what we can call perceptual fluency, something I'm not going to talk about here, but just the ability to kind of see and recognize things. All right, so technically it says my second, but I guess third VLQ, I'm not going to be too obnoxious about that, is which of the following statements do you believe about relationships? Do you believe that absence makes the heart grow fonder, or do you believe out of sight, out of mind? So go ahead and answer that, and we can talk about that. Okay, so when it comes to that question of birds of a feather or out of sight, out of mind, we often work on this idea of the matching hypothesis, the tendency to choose partners who are very similar to us in terms of attractiveness and other qualities. So we might kind of marry at the same level, and also these people also somewhat look alike, right? And then you come to this question about matching versus the most attractive person, right? Do men want to pick the most attractive person versus do they try to match? Do women try to pick the most attractive person versus do they try to match? We're going to talk about some of that in class. I got a cool video for us, but I don't want to get hit by DMCA. Now, one study looking at this idea of matching versus most attractive, something else we'll talk about, was a UCLA dating study. So in one study, men believed that they were part of a dating study and that they had to submit a picture of themselves in a folder. And in addition, they received 5 folders, each with a picture of a woman. So they submit their picture, and right, this is kind of like a analog version of Tinder, right? You upload your photo, and now you've got 5 photos coming back at you. And what they did was they had the women range differently in their attractiveness, and this was pre-done by coders, so there had already been kind of evidence for how attractive these individuals were. And what they did was they asked men, for each of them, would you like to be asked on a date, right? And what's interesting is this is kind of like swiping right, I guess, right? Would you like to, would you like to ask this person to go on a date? And men tended to choose the women who matched them in attractiveness. So if a man was a 5 out of 10 on attractiveness scale, right? And you had a 10, a 7, a 5, a 2, and a 1 in attractiveness of these women as rated by as ranked by raters. What you would see is the man wouldn't go for the 10, being a 5 himself. He might aim for the 5, or in this study, theoretically, the average man would aim for the person who matched them in attractiveness. Now, they did a very similar study 2 of this and just changed a few details. So when men got the pictures of the women, they were told that all of the women had already basically swiped right on them and were interested. And when this happens, the men don't choose the 5. They tend to choose, right, the 10 or the most attractive women. So again, a lot like this idea of Tinder, which is very interesting that we see this even before. So the question is, why is similarity important in attraction? Right? Why is it important to see these kind of similarities? Well, similarity facilitates smooth interactions. Knowing somebody and being able to understand what they're going to do makes us more able to kind of get in the groove and do things right similarly. So if you and your friends come over to play board games or have dinner, everybody kind of knows what to do, and if there's something awkward, nobody cares, everybody laughs it off. Not only is similarity important for that reason, but we now can kind of have somebody else to make our own little echo chamber with, right? Because it validates our own characteristics. Well, I'm loved, so that's pretty good. We expect that similar others will like us too, so I like me, and I assume that other people like me will like me. So there is this idea, though, this complementary hypothesis. Why do people believe in this idea of, right? What would you say? How would I phrase that? Opposites attract, right? So why do people keep believing this? Well, what actually happens is men and women tend to like different things for long versus short-term relationships. And one thing that's really nice in shorter term relationships are people who are different, who are novel, who are new. But this might not be the best for a long-term relationship. And I'm sure some of you guys can think of why. With that in mind, let's move on to this third VLQ. So is physical attractiveness universal? If so, what are some things that you think that are universally attractive? And additionally, are there certain things certain cultures might find attractive? Can you give an example of something from a culture that might only be attractive to someone from that culture? Preferably not just US-centric as well, if you can think of this. But go ahead and answer those questions, and we will talk about this a little here as well as in class. All right, so when we talk about what brings us together, we do have to bring up physical attractiveness because that is an important part of what makes us attracted to other people. So there was a study in 1966 for freshmen for a welcome week at a university, a dance. They made up a dating service and matched participants together to go to a welcome week dance. So basically people filled out, they had this big thing at the beginning that said, we are going to try to match people up based on personality, based on your personal info. And why don't you guys all fill this out and we can find you a date to this first week dance. And then they basically just put people together. They didn't actually match them based on personal info. And the only question they asked at the end that we're caring about right now is, would you like to see this person, whoever you matched with, again after this date? There's only one thing that predicted a yes to this question, not how they rate, not their personal information, not their personality. It was how attractive they were. And I guess, one thing to note is this was also true regardless of gender. And I mean, I think there's something to bring up with this because, attractiveness means a lot. And we notice people we notice when things aren't correct. For instance, I love this picture because, there are multiple problems, but one is just very apparent to us. But when it comes to physical attractiveness, there's some other things that go on here that are really useful if you are physically attractive, So for physically attractive people, they end up with this idea of this halo effect. But we've already kind of spoken about this a little when we talked about persuasion, That physically attractive people tend to have a wide range of positive characteristics, So believing that maybe they are just better, nicer, kinder people. In a study looking at plastic surgery in a pre versus post, what you see is that people are seen as more kind, sexually warm, and likable after reconstructive or plastic surgery, which is kind of not exactly what we'd hope to feel. A really interesting study looked at attractiveness in MBA graduates and how much money they made. So what they found is they used a 5-point scale of attractiveness. So they rated people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in attractiveness. And what they found was that overall, men for each level of attractiveness. So they would earn an extra $2,600 per year. So if you were at a level 5 of attractiveness, 5 times 2,600 is, what's that, like 13 grand? And women, it's slightly less, actually. This might go into a lot of factors in terms of pay and other things of this nature, but suggesting that just as a whole, being more attractive means you're more likely to earn money with an MBA. Well, geez. The question becomes, is the stereotype true? Are physically attractive people just better in all of these? No, it's not. Physically attractive people are not more intelligent. They're not more dominant. They're not happier or mentally healthy than unattractive people. However, they do have some advantages. They're more comfortable and competent in social situations. They're more socially skilled. Why? Well, it's probably a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're attractive, people probably want to talk to you, so you get more time and skill building and practice in social situations. Maybe you become more comfortable, you become more confident. People like that confidence, and it kind of builds itself out of that. But we know that there are other things that talk about attractive, or other kind of things when it comes to attractiveness. There's facial symmetry, actually. If you look at this picture on both for both of these pictures, look at A, look at C, and look at E. And which of the three do you find to be the most attractive generally? Well, what you see is that for these, it's actually when the face is mirrored and looks correct. Most people will say C for both of these, but actually A is the original face. You're only mirroring half the face. So you would take this half of the face, say, and just flip it, right, cut it down the middle, and then just project it reversed onto the other side, and that is what C and E are. So, for instance, 2, we can talk about this idea of averaging faces. Now, this is not making people look average, but this is taking the average distance, height, color, etc. about different people's facial features and kind of putting them together. And what you see is that E is actually A plus C, right? So this average of physical attractiveness, there's a couple interesting, there's a website. If you're interested, I can go ahead and show you. But what you see here is as we make these composites, right, adding more random people's faces to this, we get more of what looks like pretty standard. I mean, they look pretty generic people, but you gotta say, right, they're not unattractive, right? That averaging all of us and all of our features together gets us to a pretty attractive person. Some other things, right, we can look at, right, which of the following do you kind of find more attractive, A, B, C, or D? And what's interesting about this is a pretty well-documented phenomenon that, right, physical attractiveness in terms of body shape, not necessarily thinness, matters. Right, the shoulder to hip ratio is something that both men and women find attractive in one another. Right, how wide the shoulders are to how wide the hips are. When we talk about this as well, which you can see in who you find more attractive down here, if you so choose to look, or right, if you want to just play along at home, what we see here is that men prefer women with baby features, where women prefer men with features that signal more mature or dominant kind of behavior. So for the women, the composite of the left image over here is the average feminine features of these people versus masculine features. Additionally, on the other hand, we see a more masculine features of a man averaged together over here and a more group of feminine, features on this man. So most people should prefer the leftmost picture, depending on who you like. But I think it's interesting to see these really and how they work, because it all goes back to this idea that there are physical differences that people find attractive, in that nonetheless there are certain things that do differ universally across cultures in terms of attractiveness. Facial symmetry, clear skin, just youthfulness. But culture also modifies some specific features that are valued. Now, in some cultures, these will ring true, but not always. Some features that accentuate fertility for women and tend to be associated with attractiveness are, unsurprisingly, butts, the waist, breasts, things like eyelashes and eyes, rosy lips, rosy cheeks, feet as well, specifically smaller feet. In some cultures, feet are binded or bound for them to be smaller, or have been in the past, I should say. Features that accentuate fertility on men, on the other hand, broad shoulders, so the wider the shoulders. The second one kind of speaks for itself. Square jaws, so a more kind of squared off, nothing, not a weak jaw. And these are some things that maybe accentuate fertility for men instead of women. So moving on to what keeps us together. We're going to talk about different kinds of loving relationships. We're going to walk through attachment styles again, but I think this should be something most people know about. We'll talk about relationship satisfaction. And the first thing I want to ask you here is, I was asked this in front of a class of about 130 people one time, and so I'm going to make you guys do it. List 5 people who you love. And then I want you to answer, do you love them all the same way? And if that is the case, yes, but if not, you probably love some of them differently than some of the others. If so, how and in what ways and why? So go ahead and take a couple moments to answer that. Pause the video. So the question becomes, what is love? What is love? Well, there's 2 types of love is originally what the research talked about. This idea of passionate love, a state of intense longing for somebody, just a kind of desire for them. This can be physiological arousal or I should say psychological interest. But when it's good, it's great. And when it's bad, it's terrible. Kind of reminds me of any thing that might be addicting. This idea is maybe some people, it's been theorized possibly people might be addicted to passionate love in the same way people are addicted to gambling, drugs, chocolate, other things. And there's also a different type of love we can talk about, companionate love. Feelings of intimacy and affection towards this other person, but not necessarily combined with passion or physiological arousal. So many of us can probably talk about a companionate love, for instance, loving of our pets, of our friends. It might not be filled with physiological passion or arousal, but this is strong commitments towards other people, deep affectionate attachment towards other people, shared values, and less intense physiological arousal than our passionate love here. And when we talk about what keeps us together, let's think about the longitudinal or the length outcome. So, in a passionate relationship, we can talk about this idea of strong and intense feelings. How long does passion last, and how does it grow or wane over time? How about this idea of intimacy, this emotional closeness, this bonding and sharing, and this importance of commitment, this decision to maintain a long-term relationship with somebody and to love them, right? So these are 3 specific aspects we can talk about when it comes to love and relationships. Our passion towards our partners, which turns out gets very strong at the beginning of the relationship and then eventually finds a dip and stays a little bit lower, If you are somebody who's frequented the dating scene, you might know about kind of the honeymoon stage when you start dating somebody before maybe a couple months later, you're feeling a little less passionate towards them. So passion is something that seems strong at the beginning of a relationship. Some relationships, again, could stay very high in compassion, but what the pattern we typically see is that this is more of the beginning of the relationship thing. When it comes to intimacy grows as the relationship goes on. And it grows rather exponentially at this certain point, towards the middle of the relationship. I like to think about this as once probably the passion phases started to wear off, now we're starting to learn about one another and becoming emotionally close, bonding, sharing who we are, and that is when this intimacy goes up. And commitment is very similar, but actually even stronger in terms of this kind of increase. And this makes a lot of sense. At the beginning of the relationship, you might not know if you want to stick with somebody or not. But then when that decision is made, it seems to stay up there, though it could theoretically wane or waver. So if we think about what a long-term relationship probably looks like, your grandma and grandpa who've been married for 50 years, they probably, love each other, but maybe not a huge amount of infatuation. They're probably very close, and they probably have this deep, committed relationship, something I think we all could hope for one day. Oops, hit a couple things. Given these three components, Sternberg, a man named Sternberg, came up with a theory of love that I think is really useful to look at. And it's the triarchic theory of love. And the triarchic theory of love is built on none other than a triangle, like all good things in psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a couple other good ones. But at the edges of this triangle include intimacy, passion, and commitment. Intimacy we can think about as liking in a relationship, right? This can be just a friendly component. We can also talk about infatuation as kind of the strongest, just purely passionate relationship, right? Almost to the point of like a stalker. Pepe Le Pew is a good example of a relationship with pure passion where, right, if you remember that, he is chasing after a cat he thinks is a skunk like him. And then lastly, a relationship with just commitment and nothing else is going to be what we consider empty love. So, right, I would suppose that most of our relationships fall somewhere on here, but if we're talking about romantic relationships specifically, we can kind of plot out different styles of romantic relationships. So what would a romantic relationship with intimacy and passion look like? Well, this would be a romantic love. So, right, two people really romancing with one another. There it is. Thinking kind of like the Titanic, the very beginning of a relationship where they're trying to romance one another. There's also this idea of companionate love with intimacy and liking. Right. So again, not an infatuation aspect, but maybe this is more like your grandma and grandpa where, right, they're just companions. They love each other very much. And maybe there's not as much passion in the relationship. There's also this idea of a relationship with infatuation and commitment, but no intimacy. So this is the idea of fatuous love. So just like infatuated with them. The best example I can give is Romeo and Juliet, who knew literally nothing about each other and then tried to get married. Right? That's not a relationship where they had any kind of intimate sharing of details about one another. They just decided to run off and get married, and we all saw how that ended up. But there's also one last type of relationship I think is worth talking about, which is the trifecta. This intimacy plus passion plus commitment. This idea of consummate love. So two people who are just really in tune with one another. They are very closely bonded to one another. They have a strong passion for one another, and they are very committed to one another. A relationship we all should hope to have one day. So that, I think, is a good way that people can help to better understand this idea of love, because love means a lot of different things. But moving on from that, this isn't a VLQ, but go ahead and just pause the video and go ahead and read these three and think about what description best fits your relationship. So I'll give you some time to do that. Well, these three kind of paragraphs that you might find yourself falling in one of them come from the idea of attachment theory. Right? And attachment theory was originally done by John Bowlby, looking at infant and primary caregiver relationships. So usually things like baby and mom, and how best to how these relationships started and grew. And there's another study that came out about 10 years later that many people have heard of, this idea of the strange situation in which we can study attachment theory. Now, I'm not going to show the video, but the strange situation allows us to kind of see how children react to their parent disappearing, being stuck with a stranger, and then how they react when mom or dad comes back. So we'll talk about this in class regarding the video, but let me skip ahead. So actually, I'm just going to skip the rest of this section, and I'll meet you on the other end. I just realized that lasted 0 seconds for you, so it did take me some time. So what I want you to answer now, or the next question I have for you, or next VLQ, I might have skipped one in that, is what keeps or would keep you happy in a relationship? If you're in a relationship, what are the things that keep you happy? If you're not or have been in the past, you can answer that. If you've never been in a relationship, what do you think would keep you happy? Name 3 things and explain why you think they would or wouldn't work. So go ahead and take a moment to answer that. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to talk about is relationship satisfaction, right? What is it that keeps you happy in a relationship? Well, one thing we can talk about is what is known as the social exchange theory, right? How we look at relationships could be thought of in the terms of costs and benefits. Now, probably not the best way to purely look at a relationship, but it is one way that I think is important to recognize, right? This might give us beliefs about the kind of relationship that a person deserves, and the probability that they will actually, seek an alternative relationship. And so success of a relationship depends on a couple things. The satisfaction that you have in a relationship, how happy you are. Are there possible alternatives, right? Can you do better, and can you do better easily? And between these two factors, we can think about, whether or not we might choose to stay or leave a relationship. So in the matrix of should I stay or should I go, we can plot this. So on the satisfaction side over here on the left, we can talk about satisfied versus not satisfied, and we can talk about presence of attractive alternatives. I can do better, so there are attractive alternatives, versus I cannot do better. There are no attractive alternatives. So if you're not satisfied in a relationship and you can do better, you're probably going to leave a relationship. If Brad is a jerk and you just don't like him, but you have somebody else you can start dating if you so choose, you're going to leave a relationship. If you're unable to do better, you might stay in an unhappy relationship, especially if you really crave being in a relationship. In terms of satisfied, if you're satisfied and you can't do any better, well, congrats, you have the best option you have, so you're pretty good. And if you can do better and you're satisfied, but you might still leave, right? You might still leave for a better deal if you are satisfied, but you could do better. However, there's a lot of barriers to that. Sometimes it's not like everybody just gets married and then divorces their first spouse to find somebody better. That's not the way the world works. But there's a much more serious question buried in here. And this is something that maybe some of you can pick up on, but I'd like to talk about this in class. So keep in mind the importance of social exchange theory and why there might be some big issues with it that we have to cover. Specifically down in this column, I'll leave you with that. All right, so that in mind, we can also talk about a different model, this investment model. So this adds two new concepts, basically two new concepts to social exchange theory, this idea of investment and commitment. So investment, that there are certain things of that relationship, in a relationship, that we're going to lose if we don't stay in it, right? We're going to lose, the time spent with our partner, their support. If they have a cat, we're going to lose access to that cat. There's a lot of stuff you might lose if you choose to break up with somebody. Excuse me. And then there's this idea of commitment, intention to continue the relationship. There might be, some commitment some commitment reasons to stay, but there might also be this kind of idea that we don't want to continue the relationship and maybe making some of these weaker. But this should make a lot of sense. Our satisfaction with the relationship comes from a couple different things, The rewards we get from it, how much it costs us, and our comparison level. Can we do better or not? As well as how much we invest, and are there any qualities of these external, are there any alternative relationships? We can also talk about equity theory, that people are more concerned about equity rather than maybe exact equalness, rather than maximizing benefits. People in equitable relationships are the happiest. And if you think about this, if you were in a relationship where you were under-benefited, say that you did all the work around the house and your partner did nothing, you're going to be miserable and feel underappreciated. If you're over-benefited, if you're doing nothing all day and your partner just tries to clean up around the house all the time, you might feel a little guilty, that you're not pulling your weight. And, I don't know how qualified I am to speak about this, I've been with my wife for almost 11 years now. We've been married for over 4. My best advice to people is try to do 60% of the chores. Try to do a little bit more than's equal for both of you, and try to pick up the slack where you can. And right, hopefully your spouse does the same. Right? If both of you are trying to pick up the slack where you can, you're always going to feel supported, which I think is very important. I mean, you don't have to take my advice, though, so don't feel like you have to. Now, this last question, this last VOQ, I believe, is regarding relationships, and we're going to talk about some relationship dissatisfaction and what makes relationships work. If you've been in a relationship, yes or no, and then if you have or haven't, what do you think are 2 keys to a successful romantic relationship, and 2 things that cause a relationship to be unsuccessful? So go ahead and answer that, and we will talk a little about this next. So let's talk about marriage and divorce, everybody's favorite. Now, many people have heard that 50% of marriages end in divorce, and it's between 40 and 50%. However, those numbers are skewed because you can only get married once, you can only get married once if you decide to never get divorced. But if you get divorced once, you're much more likely to get married more than 2 times. So in fact, we see that remarriages have a higher divorce rate. People who cohabitate before getting married, my wife and I did, have a higher divorce rate. Great. Children of divorced parents have a higher divorce rate. All of these things matter, but in fact, the first marriage divorce rate is more like 30%. But there are some things that are more likely across I guess failed marriages is the way to say it. Marriages that have ended in divorce that we see throughout. When do marriages end, though? Well, usually within the first 6 years. I'm almost through it. And we know that the most divorces specifically occur between the 2nd and 3rd year of marriage. We've made it through that, so that's good. But marriage in general is kind of a complex topic, and we know that marriage is changed in its definition, and there's a lot of things that I don't think I've really mentioned regarding this that have been mostly done on heterosexual couples, making this research, right, not valid for a decent chunk of the population who don't exactly fall into that specific category. So do recognize that there's not a lot of there's not a huge amount of data from years and years of how this looks and if there are differences between heterosexual and homosexual marriages or any other types of marriages. Doesn't seem like there should be, doesn't seem like there will be, but I think there are probably a lot of similarities and differences. Anyways, that was something I should have made a lot earlier. But let's talk about what's bad for a relationship. So, kids, are you looking to ruin your relationship? Well, if you do, I've got the best advice for you. There's 4 horsemen that really can ruin a relationship. You want to ruin your relationship? Start criticizing your partner. Just tell them how awful they are at everything they do, right? Even if they do things great, just remind them that they could have done it a little better. If they ever talk back to you, just be defensive. Say, why are you being like that? I don't understand, why are you getting so upset? I'm just trying to help you. You can also stonewall them, so just stop talking. Just no. Right? All these things just sound like a great relationship. The last one, though, and the most important of the 4 horsemen, if you want to ruin a relationship, have contempt for your partner. Hate your partner. Right? Contempt is what to me is like a pothole. It's just a little crack, and then every time you get mad, it's like you throw some water in there and it freezes and expands, and the crack grows bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And contempt is a terrible, terrible thing, this kind of blind hatred of your partner over maybe little things. And it probably comes from this negative attitude you're having towards them that maybe you want to work on, because maybe you're starting to interpret any information you see about them through this negative attitudinal lens. Contempt is the worst thing for a relationship. Though being critical, being defensive, stonewalling, and not talking to your partner all are negative and some of the worst relationship behaviors. This is aside from abuse. Abuse is its own category of which I'm not covering here. What else is bad for a relationship? Jealousy. Being jealous is very, very bad. It is the negative side of passionate love. right? One becomes consumed with the negative thoughts and feelings about a partner's suspected infidelity, usually with jealousy that right, that they don't love you anymore, kind of this consumption of this. And apparently, though, I lied. There was one more VLQ, so hope you kids didn't just skip out there. Which of the following is more upsetting to think about? Your partner developing a close relationship with another person of the opposite sex, or your partner sleeping with that other person of the opposite sex? Which is more upsetting to you to think about? So, right, with that in mind, what we find is that men relative to women are more likely to get jealous in response to sexual infidelity, while women relative to men are more likely to get jealous as a result of emotional infidelity. And this fits in, right, pretty clearly with our understanding of these more interdependent women tend to be more interdependent, men tend to be more independent, imagining that this more emotional infidelity, this more relational cheating might be more hurtful. Not that the other ones are not hurtful to your partner or you. I guess mostly to your partner. They should hurt you. You shouldn't do that. Don't cheat. But with that in mind, a study on 351 couples who had been married for at least 15 years asked, why did your marriage last? And the things that they said included friendship, commitment, similarity, being positive with one another. Finding that another study found that romantic love can last, right? This idea of this passionate love minus obsession, right? What we see is that we can get similar brain activity, brain activation, brain region activation specifically to newly formed couples from oldly formed couples, I guess you would say, but people, right, who have been in long relationships. And part of that comes from continuing to do those things that you might do in a beginning of a relationship, go on dates, continue to treat them in that kind of passionate way. So the three keys to success, in my opinion, are capitalizing on the good, sharing, specifically sharing in your partner's successes when they do good, being playful, right? Have fun, go on dates, be silly with your partner, and then looking on the bright side, right? And really specifically this idea of being grateful for your partner, even in their faults. So with that in mind, that is the end of an era, I suppose. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this class. I thank you very much for taking it. I know I will get to see you in person again, but as always, if there's anything I can do to help you, or if you have any questions about anything social psych related or not, I am always available. You can shoot me an email, and I hope that I get to see you guys around at some point. And if you ever need anything, do let me know. At this point, I'm rambling, so it was great having you all in class. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you later. Bye.